then came the issue of vulnerability, and I started to really question if this is something that I wanted to put forward. It really kind of challenged my issues that I had with humility and self-worth and doubt. And anyway, I really had to get over that and say that, yes, I'm going to put it out there, and perhaps there may be people that would like to get a print. So we're going to make prints with the money donated today, and 100% of that sales money from those prints are going to go to the wonderful organizations that are already working out there, such as Walking with Our Sisters, that I'll talk a little bit about later. And then Pete asked me on Saturday to come and talk about everything. And I said, wow, he's really pushing me to heal some of my wounds here. Yes, I've kind of started becoming a public speaker about what I'm going to share with you today, but I have in fact been studying the information since I was a Master's of Social Work student and knew I wanted to work in the field of caring for Indigenous youth in care. And so I've been studying over the last 10 years all the information that I could get on residential schools and all the information that I could get on our history here. And as an Indigenous woman, I have to say that being up here is a journey of vulnerability for me, because not only am I sharing knowledge and sharing truth about what's happened in this country with our Indigenous people, but I am sharing with you my deepest wound as an Indigenous woman. And it's bittersweet in that I get to share the story, the needed story that needs to be heard, but also that I'm in fact kind of pulling off my Band-Aid and exposing my wound. And then I take great comfort in knowing that all of you are here on your own journeys of vulnerability. And I take such solace in knowing that you'll be journeying with me, and your support and your blessings for having me here today and encouraging me to use my print. I'm forever grateful. So Chi-miigwech to all of you for being here today. And Chi-miigwech for Pete for continually holding this sacred space for us to come and do these journeys together and providing the needed teachings and ceremonies. So I need to, before I can go into the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women and the print that I have created, I need to give you the background on why there's missing and murdered Indigenous women today. And so I'm going to ask you to take a bit of a journey with me going back in time. This journey begins hundreds and hundreds of years ago when settlers first arrived here, but we're going to start in the 1800s. You see, up until the 1800s, our relationship with the Europeans was a fairly good relationship. We were in partnerships with the fur trades and as military allies. And then there was a huge shift because there's no longer these wars and the continent was at peace. The fur trade had died, and we now had a country whose economy was based on timber and agriculture, and there's this new need for land. And about 1812, we were outnumbered by settlers 10-1. And that wasn't just due to high levels of immigration, but that was also due to our diminishing numbers due to poverty and disease. And at this time, because land was now the new economy, there became conflict because we had differing ideologies on how you should treat the earth. The settlers wanted land. They wanted to ravage the land for its minerals, and they wanted to tear down trees for timber, and they wanted to do agriculture in a way that we didn't think was taking into consideration the consequences that such destruction would leave on this land. And most importantly, we have a spiritual tie to the earth. We relate to her like a mother would with a child. A child would care for her mother. It is sacred. And so things shifted, and there was a European superiority that came full force with dominance and assimilation. And during this time, very aggressive assimilation policies were created. Slogans and propaganda such as "the only good Indian is a dead Indian" were not just spoken but lived. And there was a lot of murders and massacres, and we were forced to sign treaties with false promises to be segregated to lands and reserves that were set up to fail us. As an Indigenous woman, It is always a knife in my heart to know that we are not supposed to be here. When this country federated to become Canada, it was also trying to get rid of its Indian problem. And what I went on to study, because of my work with children in care, I specifically wanted to look at residential schools. And I must tell you that even as an Indigenous woman going into school and doing the research, it was something that was kept secret from me too. Nobody was talking about what happened there, and the government did a really good job at keeping everything hidden from us. And so it's been called Canada's dark kept secret, best kept secret for a reason. I'd like to tell you and focus a little bit on these schools, because what had happened was they thought the best way to assimilate us into a Eurocentric culture was to break the bond between a parent and its child. If they could take all the children away from us, we wouldn't have teachers to teach us about our culture, and more so, the teachers that now replaced our parents would make us feel ashamed of our culture. And so these schools were going on for quite some time in Canada. In fact, I get a little frustrated with all the work that I do, because as much as I try and focus on providing statistics to people, I can only give you the numbers of the federally operated schools that existed in this country. And I know that there was provincially operated schools and schools that ran under religious orders. So federally operated schools existed officially from 1828, and the last one closed in 1996. And it was mandatory that all children between the ages of 5 and 15 had to attend these schools. In fact, school administrators were given legal guardianship over these kids, so parents really didn't have a say. These schools were aimed to kill the Indian, save the man. And these schools ended up being the most horrific thing that could ever happen to people. They stole our babies. The only numbers that I am very sad to give you, because I know that they don't quite represent the number of kids that went to these schools, is there's 150,000 children that attended these schools. They were at their peak in the 1930s. And when an investigator went into these schools in 1922 and saw the horrific conditions of what these children had to live through, he labeled it the national crime. And he was fired. This has been kept a secret for a reason. Assimilation for these children started immediately. As soon as they were taken from their families, often coerced, or parents given false promises, but kids were often, trucks went in and they loaded them up. They entered into these schools, and their sacred braids were cut, their handmade with love clothing were taken, their names were taken away and replaced with a number, and they were punished for speaking the only language they know. And that's just how their story began. I would like to say that that is abusive enough. Actually, I would like you to close your eyes for a moment. And I just want you to imagine what it might be like to be a 5-year-old and taken from your parents. Suddenly in a new institution you're supposed to call home. And all the love that you endured as a child growing up in a family was replaced with shame for being who you were. I want you to just think how that child felt, just in that moment, knowing they would probably never see their parents again, or they didn't know where they'd see their parents again or when. And the hardest part for me now as a mom is trying to imagine being a parent and having my child taken away from me. 150,000 children. And I just want you to sit with that, because that is spiritual and emotional abuse and psychological trauma. But the stories go on. And we know that these children went through horror stories of verbal, sexual, and physical abuse. And I'm not going to share them with you today. I'm going to ask you one thing. I'm going to ask you to imagine what torture might be like for you. And know that that was at least one child's story. And I want you to go home, and at some time, when you have supports in place for you at the end of the day, I want you to Google a residential school survivor story. Because there's 90,000 survivors today. And they had the courage to tell their stories. And I want to give them the respect that they deserve and the compassion they need by listening and receiving. So our stories don't start there. Sorry, don't end there. We know that these kids were often going as young as the age of 2. That sometimes their parents were told they would come back in the summer, but often they didn't. It was a privilege, that's actual documentation, a privilege if the child got to go home for Christmas. So most often the case, these children didn't go home at all for the whole time at school, which for some of them was 10 years. The date that I gave you when the last one closed was 1996. How many of you were alive in 1996? So this is my father's generation. My grandparents went, great-grandparents went, great-great-grandparents went. So we're dealing with a population of people that have been continuously traumatized. And the kids that I work with in care are the ones that have either are the kids of these survivors, or they're the kids of the next generation, and this intergenerational trauma passes on. And I know all of you know, because you come here to Pete's Circles for this journey of healing and working on your wounds, and you know how difficult it is to deal with trauma, and you know how trauma passes down ancestrally. So we have many, 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 many people experiencing trauma. And this is confounded by a country that doesn't acknowledge it. And this isn't about shaming, and this certainly is about white guilt, because it doesn't serve anyone. This is simply asking you guys to know, to learn. And I certainly take the responsibility as someone who knows the truth to share it so you can learn. But please know you've been kept in the dark for a reason. And we seem to finally have a government that is trying to move us forward, who's trying to do reconciliation. Some of you may be aware that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission last year released a report. They were created to help bring the story forward, and they interviewed 7,000 survivors, and they came up with 94 calls to action on how to bring reconciliation forward in this country. Many of them are in education, because our historical textbooks certainly don't share this truth. Many of them are about child welfare, because kids in Canada under 14 in care, half of them are Indigenous. And did you know that we just filed a human rights complaint against the federal government because we are overrepresented in childcare, and yet the federal government, who's responsible to fund us, underfunds us compared to non-Indigenous kids. And so the Assembly of First Nations, in combination with the Native Child Caring Society here in Ottawa, filed a human rights complaint in the Supreme Court, and we won. And the government didn't, thank you. And the government didn't try to stop it, but they have yet to do anything about it. So here we are. And then there's the issue such as missing and murdered Indigenous women. Over the last 30 years, 1,200 women have gone missing or murdered that are Indigenous. And we're trying to get a handle on why this is happening to us, why there's such violence targeted at us. And I know we're a vulnerable population, because we're overrepresented, but there's no excuses, because yes, some of our kids, I see them in care and they break my heart when they leave because they give up on us. They give up on people that are supposed to be taking care of us. And they choose the streets. And many of them get hurt. But our girls that are simply trying to walk home at the end of the night from a friend's house are also getting hurt. And this is confounded by the lack of attention and concern given by the media, given by the public, and given by the politicians, and by the professionals that pledge their life to protect people, and they don't. They turn the other way because it was just another Indigenous woman. So in a healing session, that I was doing with Pete, we were talking about this pain, the pain that one feels who's Indigenous, because it is so very, very, very deeply rooted. And I said to him, but sometimes that pain ignites in us a fire for a torch worth its weight in carrying. And the artist in me said, hey, I have an idea. I should draw that. And so that is why I created this print. It was a part of my healing of the soul wound that I carry. And I wanted it to represent not just the pain that we feel, but the resiliency and strength that we have as well, because we're so desperately trying to light a better path for our children. And I also want to share with you a healing journey that I recently had. When we were going to the source of my sorrow, I know many of you have been on a journey, so you'll understand how this goes. I came down from the clouds. There was lightning in them. I knew something was coming. And as I came down to the earth, it was a very dreary day. It was raining. And the way everything was forewarning that something difficult was going to happen. And suddenly I was in a field, and it felt really haunting. And I looked all around me and saw that suddenly the grass turned into graveyards. Thousands of them. And once that realization set in, suddenly above them were the spirits of thousands of children. I recognized the first little spirit in front of me as a little girl from one of my photos that I use in my presentations on residential schools, and realized that these were all the children that had died at residential schools. We have 6,000 deaths documented to this date. But our documentation that we've tried to find often fail to show us a name, fail to show us what the cause was, and certainly don't tell us where that child was buried. In that moment of seeing all those children, it hit me. I felt the pain, the grief that a mother would have for her child, times 6,000 plus. And then I felt the grief of the 150,000 survivors that had gone. Students that had gone. And then I felt the grief of all their relatives that had to watch them go and couldn't do anything about it. And then I felt the grief of the loss of the hopes and dreams that our ancestors had had for us. It was the most difficult journey, obviously, that I had ever been on. But I knew it was a wound that I had to heal. And I share it with everybody today because I know for our people to heal that we need your acknowledgement of the pain that we are going through. I know in order to move forward that you need to have the awareness and knowledge of what's happened in this country. And that awareness and knowledge will give you the understanding, and it should give you the compassion that we need. You see, we live in a fog in this world where we seem to walk around and think we're all strangers to one another. Indigenous issues is a topic that comes up for me often. And often conversations happen about what people believe mismanagement of money is and what they think politics are like, and they go on, and I say, I'm sorry, where's the mom? I'm looking to talk to the mom that wants to help that mom. I seem to have lost that connection with each other. Our medicine wheel philosophies is about interconnection. We need to have the conversations. We need to talk about our misunderstandings. We need to learn to relate and connect to one another again if we're going to ever have reconciliation and move forward. We are not supposed to be here. I'm sorry, but Canada's Day is a very difficult day for me. But we're still here. And we welcome you with open arms to help us on this journey. I have so much hope that it will get better. I know it will get better. And especially when I look at beautiful spirits like you who want to know and who want to help and who want to relate and who want to connect, I have so much hope. I know it's going to be a bit of a rough road to move forward because there's been a lot of devastation in this country and we're struggling. We have reserves that are in third world conditions that don't have the resources and supports to help get them through crisis. And we don't really depend on the government anymore. So we're calling out to all our friends out there, to everyone else on the medicine wheel that maybe be able to lend a hand. Someone told me this wonderful quote, and I believe it was Jim Carrey's actually, that hope is walking through the fire and faith is leaping over it. Once we get past the hoping and into the knowing, that's where magic happens. And I loved it. So I tend to say I'm about faith more than I'm about hope now. We've certainly been through a colonial fire. What has happened to us is colonialism, a cultural genocide, and it's been labeled the Indian Holocaust. And it's not over yet, because there's still so much racism and inequality. But I believe in us. I believe in everybody out there, that we can connect to each other again. So I say, even though that colonial fire hasn't never been extinguished, maybe we don't extinguish it. Maybe we make an offering of tobacco into it and we make it a sacred fire. And maybe we all sit around the fire together and we all put in an offering and an intention that we will do what needs to be done to make this world a better place for our children. And we can only do that together. So if there's anything that I ask, it is let's connect. Let's have these conversations with more people out there. You are now all carriers of this knowledge, and you have a responsibility to share it. We do a disservice by being neutral, by pretending to be bystanders. We have a responsibility to our children and our children's children and the 7 generations ahead to create a world that is beautiful for them to grow up in, that is based on equality and compassion. It's about finding heart again. I always quote my favorite chief, Sitting Bull, because he always says, it's time to come together and do what's in the best interest of our children. It's time to come together and make a better life for them. And we've always believed in coming together. We've always believed in the sacredness of unity in the hoop, and that we all sit in it together. So I hope that although your hearts may be a little heavy, I'm smiling because I'm going to say Pete will take care of that. My hope is that you also feel a little bit inspired, that you can make a difference. My hope is that you all move forward with me in reconciliation, because reconciliation in this country is about all of us. Reconciling the issues within yourselves, reconciling the issues you have with one another. It's about relationships. It's about coming together. And I'm hoping that you also feel inspired to work with me together at that, and making the needed bridges to create this future, this present that we need. Because every day we are given the chance to write history. So let's make it a good one. Chi miigwech.